This is the City Sites Podcast with Larry Kutzler.
Is this life connected to the next life? Jesus faces that issue directly.
The problem about life after death, it goes back to the more fundamental issue of life before death.
What Jesus does is he connects the two.
Jesus said, "What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul?"
Human beings live with a very broad horizon, and they have a sense that they are heading somewhere. They know that they're being thrust forward. They can't stay where they are. And so the question arises, where am I going? And that question raises the further question, who am I? What kind of thing am I? Which is really the deeper question. Am I just a physical object of some sort, a brain or a body? And their experience tells them they're not, because what makes up a human life is experience of seeing, of hearing, of thinking, of feeling, willing, deciding, choosing, thinking about large issues. And they get an education, and that broadens their horizon. And so they associate those two questions, who am I or what am I? Because where I am going is going to depend on how you answer those questions. I am on my way somewhere.
I have a lot of friends who do crazy things. Some travel to Peru to climb mountains. Other friends have winter camped in sub-zero weather. Yet others have traveled to Thailand looking for the wreckage of World War II airplanes. Well, they're all true stories. However, I have never had a friend who decided to build his own coffin until now. Neil Saltzman is a carpenter, a businessman, entrepreneur, and a good friend. So, Neil, before we jump into your story of coffin building, tell us about yourself. Where did you grow up, and what things happened in your life that changed your life?
Where I grew up was in South Minneapolis, and my father was a carpenter, so I kind of had that background of desiring to do carpentry. Also thought I'd be interested in forestry, so I went to school and got a degree in forestry, but nothing ever opened up. So I worked my life mostly in carpentry, doing remodeling until I started inspecting. So that was kind of the background of my work experience. So we'll talk about the biggest change in my life happened right after college when people were talking about Jesus and being raised Jewish. This was one of those kind of no-nos. You don't talk about Jesus. That was their thing. We never learned that Jesus was actually Jewish.
Yeah.
But finding that out and doing a lot of reading and praying, God revealed himself to me one day while I was working. And it was miraculous revelation that kind of just came into my heart, like the Lord was speaking to me. That, yes, Jesus is my son, believe on him. And yeah, it was a big change in my life after that.
Well, it's kind of interesting. Two things about that. You and I grew up in the same neighborhood, didn't know each other, and we went to the same high school, didn't know each other. So it sort of kind of evolved into friendships later in life. Anyway, I appreciate you, Neil. I appreciate your testimony. And growing up Jewish, did you attend a synagogue or any of that, or was it just a secular?
I did.
You did? Okay.
I went to the Dathasherim Synagogue over there on 34th and DuPont.
Yeah.
And within walking distance of my house.
Okay.
So that's where I went, and I was bar mitzvahed.
Okay.
At 13. So I went through the kind of traditional Jewish upbringing. And Hebrew school, too. I remember going there after regular school as a young boy and spending most of the time out in the hallway.
Well, South Minneapolis back then, if you recall, there were a lot of Jewish folks back in the neighborhood, and there were people, I know there was a Schwartz family. I grew up with the daughters of that family. A lot of Jewish people at West High. They came from around the lakes and different things, but I had no interest either back in high school, whether Jewish or Christianity or nothing. I mean, I was more, like a rebel or a Korean criminal in a lot of ways.
Well, we have that same background, Larry.
We could have shared a jail cell sometime, but fortunately we didn't.
Thank God we didn't.
I asked those questions about your religious background to give people sort of a background to who you are and where you went once that change in your life took place. So today, that gives us the context for the only friend I have that has built a coffin for himself. I heard that over coffee when you were telling me that, and I kind of looked, whoa, what's going on with Neil? So tell us what's going on with Neil to build a coffin.
Truthfully, I never had any desire, I want to build a coffin. It was my sister and I were discussing death, and we actually bought a cemetery plot together. And in the midst of that, she had heard about people building their own coffin. So she sent me some information, and people, there's a lot of websites out there, how to build your own coffin and all this. And so I started reading through it, and I thought, well, that'd be a fun carpentry project to do. And, in the meantime, it's a bookshelf is what it is. I put shelves in there, and there it stands. And so that was the idea behind how it came about. It was just more of a whim.
So you have told your family, right? Or not? Is it a secret that it's a coffin sitting in your living room?
It totally is out there, and everybody's seen the picture. I actually took a picture of me standing in it for a joke, and I think most everybody in the family finds it very humorous. One thing about this, Larry, is we're all faced with death eventually. It's one of those subjects that people don't want to talk about, right? And I just thought, why not? This will be something. I've got 9 grandkids. I can show them. Here's where Grandpa's going to be someday, and if that opens up anything in their mind or they want to talk about it, at least it's an open subject. I don't like having a lot of things that we can't talk about, especially death. I mean, we're all going to be faced with it. So the key is knowing where we're going when this is all over.
Now, there it is. That's the caveat, knowing where you're going after death. That's why I love opening conversations with people about that very topic. I start from the end and move to the present, but where do people go after death? And most people prepare in life. They get an education, they get married, they have kids, they buy houses and businesses, and they prepare. However, few really think about that end of life. Where do we go? And you're right, Neil, nobody wants to talk about that. And I'm not quite sure why that is, because it's just a conversation. Where do you go? And certainly somebody could say, I don't know. And then, of course, that opens up the idea of the gospel. So why do you think people just avoid it altogether? Fear? What do you think?
If they don't know where they're going, it can be very fearful. I actually remember one event as a small child. I used to ask my mother what happens after death, and she didn't have an answer for me. And I used to run around the house screaming, thinking about dying. Yeah, and if you don't have an answer, it can be scary. Yeah.
Well, death is not something that is usually a topic at the table, but at the other hand, there needs to be times when we do talk about life and death issues, right? I remember my wife in her early career worked for a CPA firm downtown Minneapolis. It happens to be a Jewish-owned CPA firm, and she got to know the guys, the owners, really well, and they would go out for lunch and whatever, and she would ask them. Some of them were rabbis, actually. They were people who were doing a CPA job along with being a rabbi. And she'd ask them, well, what do you guys do with death? I mean, what happens? And they had no answer. Over and over again, they would say things like, well, if you lived a good life and you gave things away and you fed into life, well, then God's got to like you and let you into his heaven. That was basically their answer. And she always thought, wow. And then she'd tell them about Jesus. And of course, that wasn't always what they wanted to hear. But was that your experience as well? Did you have friends that were Jewish that had no answers?
Totally. Larry, yeah. If you try and bring up that subject, they just didn't want to talk about it. It's a challenge. You're right, to get people to start to think about those life and death issues.
You and I have known, life and a lot of different experiences over our years. We've lived most of our life. That's in the background. But looking forward, I don't fear the future. I don't fear if I happen to get a disease or I get run over by an ATV or something. I guess I just don't worry about it. How about you? I mean, do you find that assurance now that you're in Christ that there's really nothing to really fear in this life or in the next?
Oh, totally. It's not a matter of fear. It's actually have that hope of looking forward to seeing Jesus, our Messiah.
And I think that Coffin said that to me. It was not a negative, it was a positive. It was like a window of opportunity, knowing that when that happens, and you actually will be in that coffin. I mean, Neil, you're going on to a much bigger, better, more exciting place with God forever. It's a positive message, not negative. What do you think of that?
That's exactly how I see it, Larry. The big question became, and this is an interesting subject for a lot of people, is, well, should I be cremated or buried? That's a kind of an open discussion. I mean, Jewish tradition is burial. When we look at the scriptures, we see, Abraham was buried, he buried Sarah, and you look at to do a word search, you see buried, everybody buried somebody. We don't see in the scriptures that, he was cremated. So I think the whole thing with cremation, it's definitely a newer idea that's come around, although burning bodies has probably been around for a long time. But in terms of Jewish faith, yet that had an influence in my decision to have this body buried versus cremated. So it's a very personal thing, and I don't judge one person or another. If they decide they want to be cremated, that's fine. It's just, that's what I came to.
Well, my wife and I have had this discussion over the course of time because her relatives are all buried. My mom is buried, and my mom is buried not far from where I live. So I've gone over to visit. She's in a mausoleum, actually, and she has a little stone there. My wife says, well, why do you go there? I mean, she's not there. She's gone. Mm-hmm. And I go, well, I know, but for me, it's a reminder she lived. She was a person, and I think when you walk through old cemeteries, which I've done in different parts of the world, I've walked in old cemeteries in Ireland, for example. I mean, they're going back to the 15th, 16th century, and I'm thinking to myself as I see that name, there's just something special about, wow, that person lived and they were buried here. But so I think it's a recognition when you have a headstone, rather than being cremated and put in an urn somewhere or thrown to the four winds. So I think there's something to be said about burial.
I agree.
Well, Neil, I want to just conclude today's conversation here with, your grandkids. You have 9 grandkids. As a grandfather now, and do you teach the Jewishness of the gospel? How do you explain your faith to your grandkids?
It mostly, I would say, is on a Christian basis.
Okay.
Who Christ is, and that's what we're living today. But yet we celebrate the Jewish traditions, such as Passover, which totally incorporates Jesus into it. It's just marvelous. So we still love to incorporate our heritage, our tradition, letting them know that yes, they're percent Jewish and what that means. And so it's a blessing to be able to share that with this next generation. Yes.
Well, it's very important, as you know, that was the admonition of the scriptures, of the Hebrew scriptures, is to teach this to your children and grandkids as you go out and come in and so forth. I think it's very, very important. You know what I realized recently, Neil? That Judaism was a religion of faith. Now, why I didn't think that before, I don't know. Maybe it's because we always associate the law with Judaism. So we think, well, the law, it's not faith, right? But Abraham had faith. That's what started the whole relationship with God, is by faith. So, we're not that far apart when it comes to Judaism and Christianity. It has to be done by faith.
By faith and obedience.
That's true,
Abraham
too.
was obedient to what God told him. that's a big key in our lives. Trying to obey what God tells us to do.
Well, I'm thankful you had a great career in construction, and you said earlier you were inspecting. So you were inspecting what?
Oh, sure. Home inspections.
My audience would be curious. So what is a home inspection? What do you do that for?
As a home inspector, there's a couple different pieces that we can do. One big thing is help educate people when they're buying a home and give them very good information so they know what they're getting into before they make that big purchase. So that's one aspect of the home inspection business that I used to do. Now I've kind of given that over to the other newer people. And now I'm continuing to do what's mandated in certain cities. It's called a truth in housing inspection.
Okay.
So that's what I'm currently doing. It's a municipal requirement in certain cities that you have to have an inspection before you sell your house. So I started the mold screening business for Structure Tech and Structure Tech home inspections, and continue to oversee that. And I'm trying to pass the reins along to the next group of people that I've trained in.
Well, and I found this fascinating because mold is a problem with Minnesota with all the moisture and everything in basements. And how many kinds of mold are there? This is a trivia question. It has nothing to do with our conversation about spirituality, but how many would you say?
I don't know exactly how many molds there are, but there's probably just more common ones that we run into when we're testing. It's probably just a handful.
Okay.
I would say.
Yeah.
6 to 8 very common molds that show up in our tests all the time.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more mold out there.
Well, and that's an important part of home care maintenance to take care of, or you got a problem. It's like sin, right, Neil? It's like sin. Mold is like sin, right? If you don't take care of it, it will spread wherever. I'll give you the last word.
Yes. Look in your refrigerator. You'll see it spread. Water is a big enemy to the homes.
Well, thanks a lot, Neil, for joining us today. Thanks for your testimony and the whole idea of Coffin building. You're at the top of my list of friends who have done unique things. That's probably number one. So thanks again for joining us.
We are bringing a bold statement about Christ. He's our only hope to face the darkness in our day. Thanks for joining us for the City Sites Podcast.
Well, there you have it. Now you know somebody who has built a coffin for themselves. I just thought it was such a unique opportunity to talk about Neil and his faith and his background, and the whole idea came about because he built himself a coffin. That was a unique challenge, I'm sure. But when you stop and think about what happens after life, it is important for you to maybe not build your own coffin, but to think about what's next. And that's one of the reasons Jesus came, is to give us understanding and insight of what is next. And he has promised to all those who believe in him to have the promise of everlasting life, to live with God forever. That's what happens after death for those that have put their faith in Jesus Christ. So we hope today has been sort of a challenge to you to think about what's next after this life ends. And I do thank you for joining us. And I want to thank Neil Saltzman for being our guest today on the podcast. And we hope to catch you next time here on the City Sides Podcast.
Thank you for joining us today. Every Friday, we bring you this podcast with interviews with people who are challenging the status quo of Christianity and challenging the cultural norms of our day. Please help us get the word out by sharing the link to this podcast with your online friends and family. Our website also contains other podcasters who are part of the City Sites network of communicators, all sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. Our website is citysitesurbanmedia.com.